afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Can I share my screen? I prepared.
I think the host would need to enable.
Yes. Is it possible? I don't know. Can you?
Yes.
Can you see
yes.
it?
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So, what I wanted to share with you tonight are some thoughts and reflections on cooperation regimes and hegemonic struggles, specifically from the point of view of developing countries. So the world is changing, the multilateral system is changing. So I asked myself, what are the implications for developing countries? What are the opportunities and challenges that they can face? Okay, so the objective of my intervention is to analyze specifically 3 cooperation frameworks. I would refer to them as regimes, although I know they're not strictly speaking regimes. I thought it would be interesting to analyze them from a regime perspective. And I will analyze them, considering them a means to expand or maintain international leadership. Okay, the context is the ongoing hegemonic transition from the liberal order to a new order, which is not still clear what is going to be. We have several hypotheses. Authors envisage several possibilities: a multiplex order, a fragmented order, or multipolar order. But anyway, we have changing multilateral systems. So I want to think about why developing countries still participate in the multilateral system and how their participation can shape their development possibilities in terms of opportunities and challenges for the national development, for the development of Global South. Okay, so what the world is changing, as we were saying, and we can see it clearly in the role, in the importance that the Global South is achieving in the world economy. If we look at the figures of South-South trade, in commercial exchange, foreign direct investment, lending, we see that the importance of the Global South is increasing. The South-South share in global trade, just to give a few examples, grew from 42% from in the time from 1995 to 1997 to 57% on average by 2015 and 2017. Okay. This is not just about China, because we can see an increase even in the same figures if we exclude China from the statistics. Okay, in this global trend, then we assist to a series of crises. Just to mention 2 of them, the most famous one are the 2008 financial crisis, which show the risk of a deregulated global financial systems and somehow made obvious the limitations of the international financial rules. And second one was the COVID-19 crisis that reflected a very asymmetric imagine of the world as far as access to vaccines was concerned, and also caused a deep value chain disruption, which somehow affected the way that firms think of their production, of organizing their strategic production. We are assisting to some process of reorganization of production processes, relocation. Somehow it's like the traditional configuration of global value chain is also shaping. Okay, so these can be seen as some of the major drivers for international change. And these changes somehow opens the possibility of a dispute, both at global level, in which we can see a challenge to the USA hegemony, but also in a more regional scale, where emerging economies are trying to strengthen their role as regional leaders. So they are also trying to struggle to increase their importance at regional levels. Okay, so I talk about hegemony. I think that hegemony can be a useful concept to address those changes, because it is referred to as the relationship among states when it becomes so unbalanced that one part can impose rules over the others. And this is true in the economic, military, diplomatic, cultural arenas. That's famous definition. But somehow the idea of hegemony implies that it is important that the subordinated groups acknowledge that those rules established by the hegemon also benefits their interests. So this idea is basic in forging the consensus, which is traditionally complementary to military power, in establishing and ensuring the influence and the control of one hegemon on a certain international or social environment. Now, hegemony is permanently being disputed. So the new context where the multilateral system somehow loosens. Now we have a weaker configuration of international rules, somehow facilitates the emergence of aspirations. So we have a new context. We have emerging countries that are trying to gain a greater importance on the international arena. And in this process, I would like to focus on the role of international cooperation, which is traditionally a strong instrument of soft power. Okay, so I thought it was useful to analyze international cooperation from the point of view of an international regime. Regimes are principles, norms, rules, decision-making. They have to do with worldviews, norms that establish rules, decision-making processes, and prescription of behavior. So they provide a vision of the world. They set praxis. They define the way that stakeholders must behave. They establish how resources are assigned to the different stakeholders in the international order, and somehow they reflect the stability of the international order. They reflect that part of the international order which is not chaotic, but it is rather predictable and ordered. So developed countries engage in international regimes because they have power. So if they manage to achieve power within international regimes, they can have a control on the norms that are internationally assumed. And they can use, they can influence those norms to benefit from international regimes, to appropriate a greater share of the benefits of international cooperation. So what about developing countries? They still engage even in a subordinated role. They engage in regimes to reduce their inherent vulnerability in an attempt to counterpart the global north power and in the permanent effort to attract resources for their national development, which they need because of their resources, their domestic resources for their development are generally limited. I thought that this framing could be used to analyze three specific framing, which are the 2030 Agenda, the development, Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, then the so-called South-South cooperation, and then cooperation for structural change, international cooperation for structural change, which is China's peculiar way of presenting itself on the international arena. It's the proposal, the development proposal developed by China. Okay. Thinking of the traditional international cooperation regime, we all know the one that was established after World War II, and the one that has been controlled by the development, the DAC, Development Assistance Committee, supported somehow the hegemony of the USA. It established the myth of development and the idea that the world was made of successful countries, and if developing countries follow the same path and follow the example of developing countries, they could converge and then reach higher standards, living standards for their population, and a higher degree of development, a higher level. So in this sense, the DAC aid regime established objectives, strategies, technical and financial resources, provided technical and financial resources, and prescribed how these resources were going to be utilized to by receiving countries, by beneficiary countries. Okay, and somehow I thought that the importance of the cooperation regime in terms of hegemony was confirmed by the fact that the challenges that we have assisted to in history, to that regimes, they all included a reform of the aid regimes. Now, if I think of the new economic international order, which was an intent of international regime reform, which took place in the mid-70s, the proposal included a deep reform of the international cooperation norms and instruments. So I thought that following this tradition, we could consider those three framing, the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda, South-South cooperation, and cooperation for structural change, as regimes. And it could be useful to analyze how they turn into terrain of hegemonic dispute, how the three of them are functional, are assumed and used as rhetoric resource by countries, by different countries. I will argue that each one somehow serves the interest of a specific stakeholders or a specific country or a set of countries. A brief look at each of them. The 2030 Sustainable Development Goal Agenda was settled in 2015. It has 17 goals, 117 targets. We all know them. It establishes a general framework and a path for development. Why do I argue that it is functional to the maintaining of US hegemony? Because it is an attempt to perpetuate the faith on GDP growth, trade, and insertion in global value chain as the basic drivers of economic development. Now, it is the attempt to maintain the idea that those that the rules that were the basis of the liberal orders somehow benefit all the states that engage with them. So it promotes global macroeconomic models, which are quite homogeneous. It takes into little account country specificity, to the point that it settles common goals for the whole world, the whole planet, regardless of the different stages of development of countries. And somehow it perpetuates the same rules that have maintained developing countries, or most developing countries, in a subordinated positions within the world economy. Somehow it is aligned to the neoliberal project, which was forged in the 80s, in the 1980s, that considered economic growth as the major development challenges, whereas wealth inequalities and ecological or environmental concerns were somehow marginal, were somehow to be considered as secondary objectives. Okay, and of course it is developed under the supervision of the United Nations organizations, which is still basically dominated by Western countries, although Global South, especially China, are more and more challenging the predominance of the Western world on the United Nations systems. Okay, so in this agenda, China attempts to limit the erosion of its hegemony by holding control of the agenda. China aims at gaining power, leveraging its growing importance on the global economies, and developing countries somehow struggle to obtain a more balanced distribution of the cost implied by global challenges, and try to avoid to support an excessive burden of global challenges, such as climate change, decarbonization. And here, it is important, I think it is quite important that developing countries manage to include some principles in the agenda, like the one as common but differentiated responsibilities, the principle of policy coherence, but they were still at the narrative level, at a rhetorical level. They could not be framed into a more implementation level. Okay, South-South cooperation has a long history. It is a second pattern, second framing for international cooperation, and it is traditionally cooperation among developing countries. It has been characterized by two basic understanding in history. The first one was of cooperation as collective self-reliance, in the sense of a coalition building among developing countries to balance the power of the global north, specifically within the United Nations system, within the United Nations Assembly. And that is somehow the tradition of the G77 group. On the other side, South-South cooperation has been assumed by the United Nations as technical cooperation. So somehow it lost its political meaning, and has come to be understood as technological transfer, knowledge, capacity building, on the idea that developing countries, which are have always been very heterogeneous and different from each other, but there was this belief that they were somehow characterized by the same needs, had common interest, and shared a worldview, which is a big simplification, but it was somehow the way that they were read and understood by the developed world. Okay, differently from the narrow dark definition of aid, which specifically and details what is to be considered cooperation and what is not to be considered cooperation, the South-South cooperation has always been understood as in a broad sense, and it included a variety of instruments, both economic and political. In South-South cooperation, solidarity, the respect for national sovereignty, no interference in domestic affairs have always been more important than quantifying like the amount of cooperation that was provided or the amount of resources that were mobilized. We assist to a greater disproportionality in assigning resources among partners, to the point that often developing countries prefer authoritarian designation of resources rather than market-based resources, because they can improve the control they have on the resources that are channeled to their countries. Okay, so my reflection, my thought is that this kind of cooperation suits best the interest of regional leaders, because somehow they can act as global of regional models which share a greater similarity with their partners, with the countries in the same region. They can understand them better. They are less different. They can act as regional champion. Okay, so they can somehow be drivers of regional development. And this is on the basis of a supposed horizontality, a relation between partners, not donors or beneficiary countries. So this is the language and the modality that is preferred by countries such as, I'm thinking of South Africa, Turkey. Okay.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So international cooperation for structural change is China's own strategy for international projections, which is an attempt to create a new cooperation regimes. China has aspiration of becoming a global player, so it has been developing a global framework for development, leveraging on structural change. So this is a new framing, which is based on new structural economy. So economic growth is still at the center of development. The heart of development are still comparative advantages, but it is included into a developmental framing where the state has the predominant role in development. Okay, so state decides, bilateral relations are important, and the premise is that China is the model to follow. And somehow it is an easier model to follow by developing countries. And that's the best way that China can present itself to the world, to its public enterprises, and offering its spectacular growth as a model and an aspiration to be followed. So China presents itself as a benevolent, emerging power, an inspiring model. Now, the big question here is to what extent China's experience is adaptable or replicable by the rest of developing countries. So opportunities and challenges, just some final considerations. In this landscape, we can have opportunities and challenges at the same time. What are the opportunities that open? Multilateralism still represents benefit for developing countries. It is really important that developing countries still engage in multilateralism because they can build alliances and somehow have a greater power and greater importance. And a loosened and diversifying cooperation landscape can benefit them. The multiplication of the financial agency, for example, can represent greater opportunity of financing for developing countries. And generally speaking, we assist to a higher consideration of claims from the South. The modality of North-South cooperation are increasingly taking into account Global South reivindication, generally speaking, and are including the modalities of South-South cooperation more often than it used to be in the past. We also have new challenges. We have the risk of new dependencies. The relation with China is quite problematic, depending on the countries, but we have the risk that the role of most developing countries in the global economy will still be characterized by dependence and will still be relegated to a marginal role. We have the need for more assertive development policies. Now we have different increased financing options, but countries have to build consensus within them on national development plans. Like they have to to set a more precise development policies within. And of course, for these inequalities that still characterize many developing countries and institutional and fiscal fragility, the exposure of developing countries to international market volatility can still represent a great risk for the development. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.